Yep, you guessed it, this video is all about airbrushing for scale models. Hey everyone, it's Matt from The Inner Nerd, and in this video I'm going to not only talk but also walk you through everything to do with airbrushing on scale models. So if you're new to the airbrushing scene or have some questions about the paints, primers, varnishes and even which techniques to complete with an airbrush, then this video is for you. Starting off with my airbrush, which is a Harder & Steenbeck Evolution Silverline. I've also swapped the tiny colour cup for a larger one so that I can easily contain enough paint to spray an entire model if needed. I actually rarely use the small colour cup now due to the way I mix paint, which you'll see later. I've swapped the needle and nozzle on this one to a 0.15mm because it allows me to spray both small details as well as the larger areas without needing to switch for a bigger one. The needles set for Harder & Steenbecks are interchangeable, so this one can be used on other models like the Infinity or Ultra, which are actually higher in the range than my Evo. What drew me to Harder & Steenbeck over other brands like Iwata is the way that they're assembled. The nozzle sits nicely into the cap, I think, and the fact that the colour cup can be removed makes it a bit easier to clean, which I'll show further in this video. This airbrush is what's known as a gravity feed because the paint is fed in from a reservoir above the airbrush body. The air comes through the bottom by pressing the trigger. When the trigger is pulled back, it opens the gap between the needle and nozzle, allowing paint from the reservoir to mix in with the air and come shooting out of the cap. The more you pull back on the trigger, the more the gap between the needle and nozzle opens, the more paint you get, and vice versa. The air pressure can't be adjusted on this airbrush, but some do feature a valve near the tip of the brush where you can manage the airflow on the fly. You don't need a super expensive airbrush or compressor to be able to do the job. I actually started with a cheapo from Amazon like this one here. It came with the air hose and connectors as well, so it's a good starter kit. It works exactly the same as my Evo but is a fifth of the price. The link for this one's in the description below. To get the air into the airbrush, you're better off getting a compressor. I've tried blowing into it, but it's hard to paint and blow at the same time. To connect the airbrush to the compressor, you'll need an airline. Most will come with 1/8 inch connectors and will fit most airbrushes and compressors. One thing I've done is to add a quick release valve on the airbrush end so that I don't have to unscrew it every time I want it removed from the line. Again, you don't have to start off with the biggest, most expensive compressor. I started with another Amazon special, which was a Chinese brand that is a white label compressor just like this one. It lasted me about 2 years before it started spitting out moisture in the air, and that's due to it lacking the anti-pulsation tank above. This tank holds the air the airbrush is pumping out, whilst the reservoir tank below is the one that sucks in the air to begin with. An upgrade to the single tank would be this one, but I'd recommend my current compressor, which is the Badger 1100. This is a 2-tank setup and has a flow rate of 22 litres a minute, which is 0.78 CFM. It's also very quiet at 47 decibel while it fills up. I wouldn't want to go anything over 60 decibels for a compressor that's likely down near your legs, or you won't be able to hear yourself think. You'll also want to go oil free, since an oil powered motor may get oil in the air feed and end up in your model. Again, links in the description for these below. Now, airbrushing paints makes them go into your atmosphere, so inevitably you're going to be breathing that stuff in unless you get a mask. This is mine and it's made by Moldex, and it's the 7001 model with the A2 9200 filters, which are made for spray vapours. If you want one of these, I've got a link in the description which takes you to Amazon. If you follow that link, Jeff will allow me to get a little bit of commission off each sale with no additional cost to you, which I would greatly appreciate if you did. Let's move on to the paints now. For this demo I'm going to be using 3 types of paint. I think the most popular being Tamiya, which are acrylic based, Mr. Paint, which I believe are acrylic lacquer based, and then AK Interactive Real Colours, which are acrylic lacquer based too. Starting with the Tamiya paints, these will need to be thinned down to be airbrushable with an acrylic thinner. I suggest keeping with the brand name when it comes to thinners, so this case will be X20A from Tamiya. AK Real Colours will also need to be thinned for airbrushing, but with their own thinner, AK Real Colours High Compatibility Thinner. And finally, Mr. Paint. These don't need to be thinned for airbrush since MRP has already done it for us. However, these will need to be cleaned up using acetone or cellulose paint thinner since they've got some lacquer bases on them. AK's Extreme Metal, however, is an enamel based paint which will need to be cleaned with white spirit. Odorless turpentine or acetone also works with these in my experience. Primers also come in all shapes and sizes. These 3, Mr. Surfacer, AK's primer with microfiller, and Ammo's One Shot. Mr. Surfacer comes in various flavours denoted by numbers. The higher the number, the smoother the finish. Anything from 1000 is suitable for airbrushing but will need lacquer thinner to be able to spray it. Mr. Colour's self-levelling thinner is the one to use for this primer. The AK primer is pre-thinned for the airbrush and can be sprayed straight from the bottle. To clean these you can use acetone or cellulose paint thinners just like you would with the Mr. Surfacer and the MRP paint. Ammo's One Shot Primer is acrylic based and ready to spray straight from the bottle. I find this not quite as smooth as the other two, but being acrylic it's much less smelly and toxic than the others, a big factor if you're spraying in a spare room or inside the house. Onto varnishes now, and these are two types, the Mysticolor GX100 which is lacquer based and then AK's acrylic varnishes. I'll talk more about these as I demo them later in the video. Okay, it's time to put the paints into action. Firstly, I'm priming the model with AK's primer with micro filler, and notice that I'm laying the paint on in a very smooth and light layer first. It's important to do this with any type of paint so that you don't flood the model and lose any of the details. The aim here is to almost dust the colour onto the plastic until it's the correct colour or shade you're after. At no point does it need to appear shiny. With that first layer down, I immediately go over it with a slightly heavier coat to build up the thickness and depth of the colour. Again, not so much that it floods the model, but builds that colour. I'm going to explain thinning, pressure and distance setups later in the video. Right now we need to see how the paint should be laid down before the technicalities. I'm keeping a constant airflow through the airbrush whilst doing this. There's no need to be turning the pressure on and off with the trigger, you want to keep that finger nice and steady and concentrate on a smooth flow of paint through the nozzle. Next up I'm going to talk about thinners. I've already run through what types of thinners should be used with what relevant paints in the previous chapter, but now I'm going to show you how to do it and the effect it has on the airbrush. A useful trick I use is to apply some thinner to a brand new bottle of Tamiya paints before you even start to use it. This will make it more acceptable in the airbrush straight from the pot. It's not a completely foolproof method though, as some paints will need more thinning. In most cases I do add more thinner into the colour cup before adding the paint. I do it this way around because it means that the thickest part of the mix, which is the paint, isn't clogging up in the nozzle and will mix better directly in the colour cup. To mix the thinner and paint together I like to open the air cap at the end of the airbrush and then only apply air by pressing the trigger. The cap doesn't need to be open much at all to allow enough back pressure into the colour cup and begin mixing the paint. You'll see this happening with bubbles in the colour cup like this. When you're done, don't forget to tighten that end cap or it won't spray anything. To begin spraying the colour onto the model I apply the air by pressing down on the trigger and then gradually pulling back on the trigger while still pressing it. It's important to very carefully pull back on the trigger so that only a small amount of paint is let through. The colour should almost magically appear onto the model as the layer thickens. Once you get this happening, move the airbrush in the direction you want to go and keep it moving in a controlled way. This will stop any hot spots when the paint builds up like a splodge. Throughout this I'm keeping the air pressure constant and my finger steady on the trigger. I'm not using any sort of on-off movement like you see those guys on Pimp My Ride spraying cars like a gangster. To know that the paint is correctly thinned, you can check the periphery of the spray pattern for any signs of spattering. Spatters are caused by the paint being too thick and kind of spitting out of the airbrush as thicker blobs of paint rather than the smooth, vaporised flow that we're after. Spatters look like small droplets of paint that aren't smooth and appear away from the edge of the spray pattern completed. So I've talked about how paint should look when it's thinned properly, but what happens when you add too much thinner? Well, this. The paint flows through the airbrush alright, but it doesn't really do anything on the actual model. It's also very hard to control because tide marks appear very quickly and it almost looks like you're painting with watercolour. There are applications for this though when it comes to weathering and you need to fade on some exhaust soot, and I'll run through this painting technique later in the video. Moving on to Mr. Paint now, and this is a lacquer based pre-thinned paint, so no need for any additional thinners. We can just add it straight from the pot into the airbrush, no worries. Nothing different with the airbrush here, I'm using it exactly the same way as I did with the Tamiya paint. So air on first by pressing the trigger down, then gradually pulling back on the trigger to let the paint flow through the nozzle. Once you hit that sweet spot where the paint is gradually building up, move the airbrush to fill the areas you're aiming at. This might take some practice, so having spare parts or even a spare piece of paper around to practice on is a good idea if you've never airbrushed before. Trust me, practice makes kinda good. So, we've got our airbrush. Our paint has been thinned and we know how to get it through the airbrush onto the model, but how fast are we sending it at the model? That can be controlled by air pressure. When you set up the air compressor, the tank will fill to the set pressure. This is often slightly higher than the operating pressure, so for example setting the pressure at 26 psi will actually mean an operating pressure of 20 psi. This is easy to see by letting the compressor fill to the max where the motor cuts out and the gauge stops rising. Then apply air through the airbrush trigger and see where it drops and stabilises. This is the working pressure. All of these pressures I mention are working pressure. That's a lot of pressure. The most sensitive paints to pressure are metallics, so I'm going to use the AK Extreme Metal I introduced before. I found that with my setup 18 psi gives the nicest result. I'm using all of the techniques used in the previous chapters of this video about how to spray the paint, so we can focus on the influence of pressure in this chapter alone. For the next segment I used a deliberately high pressure of 28 psi, 10 above of what I normally use. At this pressure the paint is coming out with too much air and it's actually drying before it hits the model. This creates an almost frosted effect where the paint feels rough when it's dry. Then on the other end of the scale I drop the pressure to 8 psi, 10 below of what I normally use. This makes the paint spatter a bit, which I talked about before, and you can see that the speckles of metallic are way outside the spray pattern, which will also dry rough. When comparing the results you can see that the one at 18 psi is more reflective because it's smoother than the others for said reasons. Building further on our airbrush skills we move on to distance. This will affect the way the paint appears on the model because the closer the airbrush to the model the more concentrated the spray pattern and vice versa, which I'll demonstrate for you now. Under normal conditions of paint type, thinning of that paint and the pressure settings explained in the previous chapters, I'll typically stay between 10 and 15mm away from the model in order to spray the main colour. At this distance I can cover the model efficiently but also stay in that sweet spot where the paint is being laid on at its best. If I now go closer to the model, below 5mm, you can see how stripy the application becomes and how difficult this would be to spray the model efficiently. It's also very hard to stop the paint creating tides this close to the model as well, like I explained when the paint was mixed with too much thinner before. Now pulling right back to 100mm and above, you can see how hard it is to actually cover the model with enough paint. Not something you want to be doing if you've got a small detail to paint, nor for covering effectively. This sort of distance also gives the paint plenty of time to dry before it hits the model, and the paints will more than likely become crusty when you've built up that layer enough to cover the primer. So far I've covered the airbrush itself, the types of paint including primers, how to thin them and what with, so now we need to seal that work in with varnish. The modeling's version of the save as button if you like. I'm going to demonstrate the pre-thinned AK gloss varnish first, which is acrylic based. Firstly I apply a dust coat to get the varnish to adhere to the surface of the model. Because I want to cover a larger area more evenly, I keep the airbrush around 30 to 40mm away from the model and spray at 18 psi like with the other paints I used previously in the video. You want to build up the layers of varnish gradually, especially when it's gloss, because you want the surface to be as glossy as possible with as few layers as possible. It'll be no good hitting it with one massively thick coat where the model's soaked, because this will get rid of the surface details you've worked so hard to preserve up until this point. Next I'm showing GX100 from Mr Colour, which needs to be thinned with the cellulose lacquer thinner. It's best to use their own brand self-leveling thinner for this, and you want it to be around 60-40. Again this one's sprayed at 18 psi. I found that this varnish isn't as forgiving as the AK one I just used, but is better once you learn how to apply it. The lacquer in this can quite easily melt your paint and the model if you apply it too thick in the first couple of coats, so it's important to lay down the first ones almost as though there's nothing there. If you let them dry naturally for around 30 minutes in between, you should be good to go for the proper coats. Again, not too thick so that the detail is lost, but thick enough so that you can see the models getting shiny. I normally spray 18 psi for gloss varnishes, but if you're finding that the gloss is drying a bit like orange peel, you might want to lower the pressure a bit, and this will let the self-leveling properties of the thinner make the surface smoother as it dries. Matte varnish is less sensitive compared to gloss, so this can be sprayed just like regular paint. I'm back to using AK's Ultra Matte varnish, which is pre-thinned acrylic based varnish. I spray this one between 30 and 40mm away from the model in a very light coat so that the varnish is making the surface go matte as I spray. No need to build this one up like I did with the gloss. With all of the technicalities covered, I'm moving on to some airbrush techniques now and when to use them. Firstly I'm going into detail on the black basing and marbling technique. I'm going to be using my most trusted paint from AK Real Colours, and that's thinned using the ratios and methods I showed earlier in the video. I start the technique by gradually pulling back on the trigger of the airbrush, allowing a very small and controlled amount of paint through the nozzle. If the paint is thinned correctly, the flow should be smooth and predictable, showing no signs of spatter around the edge of the spray pattern. Once the paint is flowing nicely, I keep around 10mm away from the model, moving the airbrush continuously and randomly within the boundaries of the panel. The air pressure is set to 18 psi as usual, and I'm keeping my finger constantly on the trigger like I explained earlier. The idea behind the black base and marbling technique is to use the contrast of the paint colour layer against the total blackness of the primer. As the airbrush lays paint onto the model in an irregular pattern, some areas get built up thicker than others, leaving this kind of dotty finish. The more passes you make with the pattern, the thicker the layers get and the more uniform the finish, but you can still see the slight variations within the layers of paint. To know when you've got the right level depends on what you're trying to achieve, but to tell when the colour's at its fullest is to note when adding more paint doesn't make it any more opaque. I think I explained that in some sort of understandable way, and hopefully the footage helps explain that too. For a more even colour, if you don't want to make this pre-weathered look with your airbrush, is to spray a regular pattern. This is the same technique you'll see pretty much anywhere by anyone on an internet, and is a perfect way to apply paint to something to change its colour. I use the same mix ratios as with the marbling technique just shown, but a little further away from the model to increase the area of coverage. As I explained in one of the earlier chapters of this video, I keep the pressure on the trigger at all times, retaining the airflow through the airbrush as well as a consistent flow of paint by pulling back on the trigger and maintaining its position. Then it's down to just letting your hand move across the area you want to cover in an even flow. I can imagine like conducting a nice calm orchestra. Another technique I wanted to show is to create exhaust soot. The paint for this technique needs to be thin more than for regular painting. I found 70% thinner gives the paint enough colour and flow, making it easier to control. Then keeping between 5 to 10 ml away from the model, gradually pull back on the trigger whilst applying the air until a very small amount of paint is transferred onto the model. It's important to keep the airbrush moving at this point so the effect doesn't become too thick. You want this to be ghosted on, retaining the visible paint below. Throughout this video we've learned what airbrushes are available, what paints can be put through them, what pressures to use and their effects, as well as some airbrushing techniques. But an airbrush won't perform well if you're not taking care of it. Once I've finished with the paint in the colour cup, I'll return the remainder back to the paint pot. Then I'll use the relevant thinner for that paint type, but usually a DIY store alternative that's a bit cheaper than using the branded thinners I showed in the thinner chapter. So for AK Real Colours, Mr Colour, MRP and AK Extreme Metal, I'll use acetone. For Tamiya and any other acrylic based paint, I'll use isopropyl alcohol. I usually do this cup clean 3 times before moving on to the flush. Next to take out the needle, I take it from the back on this hardened steam bed because it suits the assembly of the airbrush. After that I'll drop some more thinner into the colour cup and flush through with air. There's no resistance because there's no needle. This will also flush the larger sediment, if any, through the brush without obstruction. Again, this is my method with this particular airbrush. You'll soon know if you're using the wrong type of thinner for the paint, since it'll probably gunge up and create these snotters which will have to be removed manually. With the main body of the airbrush clean, I wipe the needle with a paper towel dampened with the relevant thinner. I see that some people like to deep clean their airbrushes after every spray, but to be honest, as long as you've got no paint lying around that's going to or has gone dry, then this level of clean has been good enough for me for several years. So the airbrush is now clean and ready for another round. I hope you've enjoyed the video and learnt something from it. I've tried to make this one both for beginners looking to buy their first airbrush setup, and also the intermediates who want to explore what can be done with an airbrush, along with some troubleshooting if it's not quite working out as you'd hoped. And don't forget the links down in the description below for my full setup, as well as a beginner set that I recommend if you're thinking of starting your airbrush journey with this video. The links are to Amazon, and if you use those, Jeff will spare me some money from his space fund with no additional cost to you as a buyer. What a guy. Also, if you like this video, hit that like button and give me a subscribe. That's all free to you, and I hope you'll join me in my next video where I'll be building a nice silver jet fighter from the 60s. Thank you for watching, I'm the Inner Nerd, and this has been my video on everything you need to know about airbrushing scale models.